attention and President Reagan's support, Congress and the Drug Enforcement Administration, or DEA, took aggressive steps to get tough on drugs in the 1980s that still has lasting consequences today. Congress passed laws and reallocated funds towards fighting the drug war from the supply side, meaning targeting drug dealers instead of users, including strengthening the power of the police. To further support the war on drugs, Congress allocated the majority of funds for law enforcement, while drug treatment and education were largely ignored, which resulted in a greater percent of the population in jail, especially racial minorities. Congress also militarized the drug war. In 1981, Congress passed a law that facilitated military cooperation with law enforcement. This new law allowed military units to find and follow suspected drug traffickers and report them to law enforcement officials, while police were given access to military bases, intelligence, research, weaponry, and other equipment solely for the purpose of drug seizures. The drug dealers and users were treated as war criminals rather than civilians, a very different treatment than most other crimes. The DEA, or Drug Enforcement Administration, and law enforcement instituted search policies to support the war effort. One of the more egregious instances of racial bias are the drug courier profiles used by the DEA. Drug courier profiles are lists of characteristics the DEA should look for the typical drug traffickers. The characteristics on the list included, among others, black male, black female, Hispanic, youth, sloppily dressed, casual dressed, or smartly dressed. Police stopped travelers based on the characteristics from the list alone and continued searches if consent was given. Since most people did not know that they could refuse a police search, officers took advantage of their ignorance and used intimidation and guilt tactics to search who they chose. In 1984, the DEA began Operation Pipeline, a drug enforcement training operation given by 300 agencies to train officers to use pretextual traffic stops and gain consent to traffic searches. Pretextual traffic stops are a method used by police officers to circumvent the Fourth Amendment restrictions for police searches. In a pretext stop, an officer pulls over a suspicious driver because of a minor traffic violation, such as a delayed turn signal or minor speeding. The actual motive of the stop, however, is to search the car for drugs, drug money, or other drug-related items. In videotapes from Florida police cameras in the late 1980s, Hispanic and African American drivers were only around 5% of the total amount of drivers on a specific section of the highway. Despite their small numbers, 70% of the drivers stopped were either black or Hispanic. Furthermore, although all of the drivers stopped on the highway were for traffic violations, only 9 out of the 1,100 drivers received a ticket after the stop, further proving that the stops were not actually for traffic violations, but to find a reason to search the cars. The 1980s policies for drug criminals were harsh and did not include chances for rehabilitation or treatment. Law enforcement actions were racially biased in their implementation of their agenda, which led to the mass incarceration that continued past the Reagan presidency and into the present.
Okay, so, sorry. So I'm going to talk about the 1994 crime bill, which is part of the Clinton administration, but it has ties back to Reagan's war on drugs. So basically, the Democrats had lost the presidential elections of 1980, 1984, and 1988 because they were seen as soft on crime. So Bill Clinton developed a strategy to appeal to red states by doing things like supporting the death penalty and advocating for more police on the streets. By trying to compete with his Republican opponents, Clinton began to make these promises more and more extreme, trying to win conservative votes. And after Clinton was elected, he passed a lot of legislation concerning crime. First was the 3 strikes and you're out law, which is, all of these laws are still in place today. This law dictated that a person convicted of their 3rd felony would be sentenced to prison for the rest of their lives without parole. This legislation disproportionately hurt communities of color, especially during the so-called crack epidemic that began during the Reagan era. And as you saw from the clip that we showed during this time, crack cocaine, which was used predominantly by African Americans in low-income neighborhoods especially, was criminalized not only by the White House but also by the media. And crack cocaine was identical to powder cocaine in terms of everything except for the consistency and the price. But crack got much more negative attention because powder cocaine was seen as a white suburban drug. The prison time, and this was also shown in the clip, the prison time that a person got for possessing 1 ounce of crack was the same a person would get if they possessed 100 ounces of powdered cocaine. The three strikes law worked in conjunction with mandatory sentencing, also introduced during the Reagan era, which didn't allow judges to consider the circumstances when sentencing someone to a crime. By not considering circumstances, it was difficult for judges to dispense fair sentences. Instead, the discretion was handed over to prosecutors, and it should be noted that 95% of America's elected prosecutors are white. Another piece of legislation that Clinton passed was the Truth in Sentencing Law, which required convicts to serve at least 85% of their sentences, rendering the system of parole we once had in this nation obsolete. This $30 billion 1994 crime bill expanded on this legislation by giving money to states to build and expand larger prisons, and it also put 100,000 more police officers on the street. This bill built the infrastructure of the militarization of local police that we see today. And although Clinton has apologized for this bill, he has said recently that the mass incarceration of hundreds of thousands of African Americans has been simply an unintended consequence. And thanks to this unintended consequence, people of color have been disproportionately stripped of their rights as American citizens. Thank you.
It is extremely important to learn about the staggering inequalities of incarcerated Black people in America and its effects on the children, family, and health of prisoners. Statistics help us see general trends in Black mass incarceration, thereby avoiding viewing it as an abstract idea. As said previously, the rate of incarceration has skyrocketed over the last 50 years, especially for Black men. Uneducated Black men between the ages of 20 and 34 are the most affected by this. Black men in their prime working years, especially those without a high school diploma, are much more likely to be in jail than white men are. In the graph, there is an especially sharp increase in incarceration among the less educated Black men, rising from 10% in 1980 for those ages 20 to 24 to 30% in 2000. In 2010, the institutionalization rate for this group dropped to 26%, but, as was the case in 2000, Black men were more likely to be institutionalized than they were to be unemployed, as there is only a 19% unemployment rate in 2010. Institutionalization and employment trends were similar, if not more dramatic, for Black men with no high school diploma ages 25 to 29. And though African Americans and Hispanics make up approximately 32% of the U.S. population, they comprise 56% of all incarcerated people in 2015. And the imprisonment rate for African American women is also disproportionate, being that they are incarcerated at a rate twice that of white women. This disproportionate jailing doesn't just affect Black adults, however. Nationwide, African American children represent 32% of children who are arrested, 42% of children who are detained, and 52% of children whose cases are judicially waived to criminal court. How does Black mass incarceration affect family life? In America, 2.7 million children have an incarcerated parent. However, 11.4% Black children have an incarcerated parent compared to 3.5% of Hispanic children and 1.8% of white children. 2/3 of incarcerated men had been employed prior to serving their sentence, and nearly 1/3 had lived with their children before going to prison. Over half of imprisoned parents were principal earners supporting their children. This is significant because when a wage-earning parent is suddenly removed from the scene, the burden falls on the remaining parent to provide for the children, pressuring families economically. This can continue even after the absent parent has been released from confinement. Incarceration reduces earning power, compounding the financial challenges affected families can face. Finding stable employment is crucial to ensuring that individuals do not reoffend. A criminal record can reduce the likelihood of a callback or job offer by nearly 50%. The negative impacts of a criminal record is twice as large for African American applicants. And white men with a criminal record are more likely to get an interview than Black men with no criminal record. The reduced employment for millions of people with criminal records costs America $78 to $87 billion each year in funding. For drug crimes and minimum mandatory sentencing, in the 2015 National Survey on Drug Use and Health, about 17 million whites and 4 million African Americans reported having used an illicit drug within the last month. But even though African Americans and whites use drugs at a slightly similar rate, the imprisonment rate of African Americans for drug charges is almost 6 that of whites. Those living in neighborhoods with incarceration rates are more likely to meet the criteria for a major depressive disorder or a generalized anxiety disorder than individuals living in neighborhoods with lower incarceration rates. I'd like to end with this quote from
I'd like to end with the following quote from a study done on Black families and the effects of mass incarceration. The practice of assigning mandatory minimum sentences to non-violent drug offenders must be abolished. When the punishment is so disproportionate to the crime, it does nothing to help society or promote rehabilitation. It is, in fact, a distortion of justice. It falls well within the responsibility of public health to be clear and present in pushing against policies that exacerbate social forces that damage the health of populations, like mass incarceration. This means robust communication efforts and engaging with the media to inform the public of incarceration's detrimental effects on the well-being of communities at large. We must also be clever about how we help tell stories of incarceration and its consequences, generating empathy and nudging a status quo that has long been unacceptable. And Kai is out sick today, so I will also be reading her section. Mass incarceration is a growing trend in the United States, with the number of incarcerated individuals increasing from 500,000 to over 2.2 million from just 1980 to 2015. However, while 1 in 37 American adults is under a form of correctional supervision, racial disparities in incarceration rates make these statistics even more shocking. In the United States, African American people are more than 5 times more likely to be incarcerated than white individuals, and African American children are 6 times as likely to have a parent who is incarcerated, leading to detrimental effects in cognitive and non-cognitive outcome assessments. In terms of mass incarceration trends in the United States, the NAACP states that if African American and Latinx individuals were incarcerated at a similar rate as white people, the U.S. prison and jail populations would decrease by 40%. Many of these incarceration rates are due to biases in arrest rates. According to the NAACP, while African American individuals represent just 12% of monthly drug users, they constitute 32% of individuals arrested for drug possession. And in 2002, African Americans made up more than 80% of individuals sentenced under cocaine laws, but served more time than white individuals, despite the statistics that 2/3 of cocaine users are of other races. Measures such as the 3 strikes laws have the possibility of imprisoning more African Americans for life because they involve drug offenses, and notions such as the war on drugs have caused more police officers to patrol primarily African American neighborhoods to look for street drug deals. These incarceration rates have vigilant economic, public health, and financial effects on our society. Criminal records have been known to reduce the chance of callback or job offers by 50%. Infectious diseases in prisons and jails are more prevalent as rates rise over 3 times the amount of the general population, and the U.S. expenses on prisons and jails has increased at 3 times the rate of spending on public education in the past 30 years. Through biases and incarceration, African American people are being denied educational, economic, and social opportunities, continuing the long-lasting effects of racism and oppression that exists in American society. Thank you.
So one of the main ways that the government justified imprisoning Black leaders during the civil rights movement and Black liberation movements in general was by taking them as political prisoners. So for anyone who's never heard of that or heard and didn't care enough to look it up, political prisoners are people who are imprisoned because of their political beliefs or for acting on those beliefs. The concept has been hugely helpful to the government in their effort to manage civil rights and Black liberation movements and essentially keep Black people from getting too much power. Black activists who spoke their opinions, fought for their rights, and organized others to assist the fight for their rights posed a threat to the government and to the white supremacists who ran it. By incarcerating these people, they could inhibit the movement as a whole. The Black Panther Party was one of the biggest victims of political imprisonment in America in the 20th century. Beginning in 1966, when the Black Panther Party was first founded, members of the party were under perpetual surveillance of the FBI as well as local law enforcement, whether for their militant rhetoric or peaceful protests, and mostly based off of questionable or blatantly false convictions. In 1967, a year after the party's founding, the FBI launched something called COINTELPRO, which is the counterintelligence program. This program was created to, quote, neutralize Black nationalist hate groups. Basically, the program allowed the FBI to closely monitor the Black Panthers and the other organizations like it to make sure they weren't gaining too much power, too much momentum. Loss of the Black Panther leaders and members who were incarcerated continuously held the party back from accomplishing its goals and spreading its message, and COINTELPRO was a large part of this inhibition.
Assata Shakur, who was a political prisoner. So Assata Shakur, a former member of the Black Liberation Army and the Black Panther Party, is an escaped political prisoner who has found asylum in Havana, Cuba since 1984. During the 1970s, Shakur was one of the most notable members of the Black Liberation Army. In Shakur's memoir, she describes the army as, quote, not a centralized, organized group with a common leadership and chain of command. Instead, there were various organizations and collectives working together and simultaneously independent of each other. However, everyone associated with the organization was grouped together and labeled as revolutionary extremists and domestic terrorists by the United States government. The association was constantly condemned by the American government and especially mainstream media, which sensationalized Assata Shakur by accusing her of promoting terrorist rhetoric to make an example out of her. The FBI sent the message that a black woman who does not conform to how white people expect her to act is inherently evil. While some members of the Black Liberation Army did engage in criminal activity, the overarching goal was definitely not to break the law, but rather to make America a more equitable country. Members described themselves as being, quote, anti-capitalist, anti-imperialist, anti-racist, and anti-sexist. Shakur aligned herself with these beliefs very publicly. In 1998, Shakur wrote an open letter to Pope John Paul II declaring that, quote, I advocate an end to capitalist exploitation, the abolition of racist policies, the eradication of sexism, and the elimination of political repression. If that is a crime, I am totally guilty. This open letter was aired for the first time on Pacific Radio's news program called Democracy Now! After the New Jersey State Police asked the Pope to call for Shakur's extradition while in Cuba. So extradition is the transfer of an individual from one country to another country so that that individual becomes under the jurisdiction and law of that second country. In this particular case, the New Jersey state officials wanted Cuba to send Shakur back to the United States so she could be punished on American soil. Shakur was also a member of the Black Panther Party in 1970 before being convicted of several crimes, including murder. Shakur escaped prison in Clinton, New Jersey, after being sentenced for life. While there is evidence that Shakur was at the scene of the crime, there is no concrete evidence that she was the murderer. Most of the evidence around her case is extremely weak. Accusing Shakur of these crimes was a very deliberate choice made by the United States government. Their goal was to stigmatize her and to create support around false charges against her in public. Shakur escaped prison, as I said, and fled to Cuba, leading American officials to offer an unprecedented monetary reward of $2 million for her capture. Assata Shakur was painted as an insane radical terrorist and international criminal, and while she truly did commit some crimes, Shakur was, for the most part, just advocating for civil rights for Black people.
I will be talking about another political prisoner, Mumia Abu-Jamal. Mumia Abu-Jamal, formerly known as Wesley Cook, is a political activist and is known for his journalism. He was born in Philadelphia on April 24, 1954. He is now the age of 63. He changed his name in 1970 because he felt that it was more expressive of his cultural past and heritage after taking a class on African cultures. In 1975, he began working for a series of radio stations using commentary to highlight issues and promote social change. These stations include What in Philadelphia and WCAU-FM, where he was the host of a weekly feature program. From 1979 to 1981, he worked at NPR. However, he was asked to resign because management believed he didn't maintain a sufficiently objective approach in his presentation of news. He began his activism as a teenager, participating in a protest against George Wallace, Alabama's governor at the time, who supported racial segregation in the South and was running for president. In 1968, he became one of the founding members of the Black Panther Party chapter in Philadelphia and worked for the party's national newspaper, the Black Panther. Through journalism, he openly criticized the Philadelphia Police Department due to the systematic racial bias and police brutality. Some of his criticism involved police interaction with the organization MOVE, which was a Black liberation group based in Philadelphia. According to the organization, the word MOVE is not an acronym. Their founder, John Africa, came up with the name. It means exactly what it says: move, work, generate, be active. Due to Abu Jamal's main focus on activism and radical ideals, he struggled to make money to support himself as a journalist. As a consequence, he became a night shift taxi driver to support him and his family. On December 9, 1981, according to Abu Jamal, he was driving his taxi when he heard gunshots and noticed his brother, William Cook, had been pulled over by the police. When he went to see what was going on, he was shot and beaten. During the trial, one eyewitness out of the many claimed that Abu Jamal wasn't guilty. However, the witness was never called to testify, and it was later learned that the witness's original statement was torn up. The jury accepted the story as follows: that William Cook had assaulted police officer David Faulkner at a traffic stop, and whilst Faulkner was trying to gain control of William Cook, Abu Jamal came out of his taxi and shot Faulkner. Not long after, Faulkner shot Abu Jamal. Mumia was sentenced to death, but after 30 years, the conviction was changed to life in prison due to inconsistencies in the original sentencing. In demand for a new trial, a movement known as Free Mumia emerged in the early 1990s, which gave the case a lot of attention. Supporters are found all around the world, from politicians to activists to religious leaders. In an article from the Huffington Post Black Voices, Mumia's voice is described as quiet and defiant, and his message has always been dangerous to those in power. Today, the movement continues. People continue to call out the clear injustice that exists in the case and the need for another trial. Since his incarceration, he has written 7 books, such as Live from Death Row, and produced thousands of written commentaries. Despite backlash against him and the justice system's attempts to isolate him, silence him, and the perpetual effort by the media to criminalize his actions, he still manages to resist it and voice his opinions and message in the way he wishes to present it to the world.
This is the story of Cyntoia Brown. She will be eligible for parole when she's 69 years old. Cyntoia Brown was born on January 29, 1988 in Tennessee. In early November, her case went viral on social media, even though she has already been in jail for more than 10 years. Brown is serving a life sentence for the murder of a Nashville man named Johnny Allen in 2004. After a childhood marked by abuse, she was raped and forced into prostitution by a pimp named Cutthroat, and ended up killing one of the people who solicited sex from her out of self-defense when she was 16 years old. Despite her youth, she was tried as an adult and given a life sentence. Details of her crime and trial, including the fact that the man who had paid for sex with her was 43 years old, started circulating in November and caught the attention of A-list celebrities. However, even before the renewed interest, her trial inspired a documentary and was a major factor. And was a major factor in change in how the state of Tennessee deals with child prostitution sex cases. So, why was an underage girl involved in prostitution given such a harsh sentence? In the words of Rihanna, quote, "Something is horribly wrong when the criminal system enables these rapists and the victim is thrown away for life." So, Cyntoia Brown's case has recently sparked outcry on social media under the hashtag #FreeCyntoiaBrown. Many celebrities such as Rihanna, T.I., Snoop Dogg have posted a tweet reading, quote, "Imagine at the age of 16 being sex trafficked by a pimp named Cutthroat. After days of being repeatedly drugged and raped by different men, you were purchased by a 43-year-old child predator who took you to his home to use you for sex. You ended up finding enough courage to fight back and shoot and kill him. You're arrested as a result, tried and convicted as an adult, and sentenced to life in prison. This is the story of Cyntoia Brown. She'll be eligible for parole when she's 69 years old." End quote. Posts like these serve as the vehicle for spreading awareness of cases like Brown's, whereas without them, our media would never even have covered it. This is because our media finds that Brown's story is not interesting or that it doesn't lead to controversy because it's common and her sentence was well deserved. In addition, Cyntoia Brown is a girl. You may know some stories about black men who have been brutalized, but because Brown's not a man, she does not receive the same support her male counterparts do. The story of Cyntoia Brown is at worst shocking, disgusting, and terrifying. At best, it's all too common. For me, Brown's case begs two critical questions. Why was Cyntoia put in her position in the first place? And how did the American justice system, built with the promise of promoting equality and the best interest of its citizens, manage to fail a child who was fed into a brutal cycle of prostitution? The answer here is multifold. Cyntoia Brown was in a system of sex trafficking and prostitution. Black women and girls disproportionately represent the victims of these crime circles because of systematic discrimination, sexual violence, exploitation, and a lack of care awarded to their communities by the government. In a documentary titled Me Facing Life, Cyntoia's Story, Brown detailed that she was abused, exploited, and raped by multiple men before the incident. Brown did not actively seek prostitution. She was forced into it. Brown's story underscores how black girls like Brown should not be placed in the positions of prostitutes or sex workers against their wills in the first place. And so, to answer the second question of how the justice system managed to fail Brown, you must consider that our justice system has a different eye for black girls. White lawmakers often view black girls as hypersexual, belligerent, and thus fit to brave the harshest punishments for crimes they are bound to commit. It is important to emphasize that Brown was tried as an adult and convicted of first-degree murder that is premeditated and willful, whereas Brown acted only in self-defense. Thank you.